name is Howard Pezim, Managing Director of Bedford Consulting Group. And on behalf of my colleagues, Cindy Gordon and Cathy Cobey, Cindy, the CEO of SalesChoice, and Cathy, E&Y's Global AI Advisory Leader, we want to welcome you all to today's webinar. Bedford Group is a global executive search talent strategy firm, and SalesChoice is an AI data sciences company that specializes in ending revenue uncertainty. Together, we have hosted a number of roundtables to advance C-level leadership, develop increased skills in modernizing their organizations, but also to ensure that the right organization design, governance, and operating practices are in place to ensure trusted AI. We believe strongly that boards and CEOs must elevate governance to manage risk and accelerate AI adoption, and believe it is a business imperative at this time. Just by way of introduction, I'm very pleased to introduce my colleagues. Dr. Cindy Gordon, as mentioned, is the founder of SalesChoice, an AI SaaS B2B company focused on ending revenue uncertainty using AI methods. You've all read the bios, but I'll repeat this. Cindy has held former senior executive and partnership roles at Accenture, Citicorp, and Xerox. She's been a venture capitalist, is an active mentor, coach, advancing innovation and diversity in Canada. She's also the MindBridge AI Impact AI Leader, AI Disruptive Award winner, and the BDC National Startup Canada Award winner. Cindy is also the author of 14 books, a Forbes AI Media Thought Leadership Contributor, and an AI board advisor to the Forbes School of Business and Technology in California. Cathy Cobey oversees a global team that works on ethical risk and control implications of AI and autonomous systems. With 25 years of experience as a technology risk advisor and a chartered professional accountant, Cathy has assisted global organizations in conducting enterprise risk assessments and used to ask better questions and address multidimensional technology issues. So with that formal introduction aside, I'd like to kick it over to Cindy to lead off.
Thank you, Howard, and Cathy, welcome. Good to be doing a session with you again. And to all of the participants, I think we have 23 logged in. I expect a few others. I went through the roster earlier this morning, and just to let everybody know, we've got participants not just in Canada, but US, but also a number of them overseas in the UK. And I also noticed some folks in South America. So welcome. The topic today is one that, we've been doing a number of sessions with the Bedford Group, and Cathy and I also did a video series. And, there's certainly a lot of momentum in terms of AI, but in terms of setting up the right operational practices, we really want to focus on some of the gaps and share very specific lessons learned, because we've been operationalizing these programs in a number of marquee brands, and hopefully share our knowledge. I'd encourage you to go to the Q&A section if you like and put in your questions early, and Howard will be reviewing those near the end. So next slide, Zachary. And the next slide, please. So let me give you a quick context of how we're going to split up the conversation, and we'll start to move at a pretty fast clip. We will be providing a copy of these slides in a PDF and also an online format later. Give us a little bit of time, probably 10 days to get everything out and organized. I'm going to start off and just sort of giving you macro view in terms of the AI industry. Then I'm going to zip down and talk about some of the specific use cases where the budgets are flowing, just so you get kind of macro global view. Then Cathy's going to take over and talk about some of the strategic implications, introduce some of the frameworks that are very important for building trusted AI. And then we're going to continue on and actually share a case study, so you actually have a complete view of an organization. It is a very large one, in the journey that they've undergone, and how they've been benefiting in terms of some of the insights. A lot of this content is giving you frameworks as if you're a board director, because I just noticed that we had a number of board directors here, and many CEOs are on the call. So this, I think, the slides you'll see will give you a good strategic framework, and obviously we're accessible to do deep dives, after, if you reach out. Next slide, please. So big picture, like first of all, you can't pick up any newspaper or anything these days, where you don't see some headline on AI. And you'd think with the challenges that we've been going through with COVID and keeping so many of our economic, logistical programs or initiatives underway. At the same time, the AI market hasn't slowed down despite some of the realities that we've been going through on our health-related matters. The market is one that's growing, depending on the research you read, between 30 and 45% per annum in terms of GDP growth. It's predicted to be a market that's over 126 billion in less than 5 years. So it's at a point now you cannot ignore AI. So if there's any, significant leader on the forum, which many of you are, I encourage you to, if you're a board director, clarify, do you have a strategy for AI? And if so, what is it? And get into the details. Companies that are going to make it or break it, if they're not starting to initiate certainly their data, I'd call it layers, because you can't really, produce AI enablement without solid data infrastructure, are really going to be left behind. It's applicable to every single industry sector. Next slide, Zachary, please. Now, depending on the reports you read, you will always find the financial services and healthcare are two of the marquee industries with, I'd say the highest percentage of innovation in terms of AI, but you will also see a tremendous amount of focus on the advertising and the consumer industry. A simple example in advertising is, I think we all know we're in the age of distraction and we're being constantly hit with different pop-up ads and things like that. Well, a lot of these enablers are driven by AI, and the whole marketing campaigns are really maybe taking the entire network from the internet and then classifying all of your movements. If you're out there, you can copy all of that and then help determine your interest with sophisticated crawlers that move things into classifiers. So the advertising world, if you've been, I know none of us have probably recently been to to Hong Kong, but there are many areas in China that if I walk by a particular billboard, and it actually maybe has also a camera, and I've not necessarily even given permission, the next billboard, because they saw I had a Gucci purse, might appear on the next block I walk into. So just recognizing how sophisticated different industries are becoming. And I think everybody needs to understand that China, if you read their country strategy, they have AI as a pillar under every single industry. So we are at a time in our life cycle in business where, between the US and definitely China, they have some significant battlegrounds to work through. How we will fare in Canada, I think we've put a lot of investment into the R&D side, but our applied innovation successes have been, I'd say far less attractive in terms of returns than I think, they need to be. And that's partially because we're not making decisions fast enough as leaders in Canada. Next slide. Now, this is just a point of view of the top 15 global use cases, and all this research comes from Tritatria. And I think also if you look at the Gartner quote, which is the number of companies implementing AI technologies in the past 4 years has grown by 270%. So the hardest thing in AI is not the initial enablement, it's the last mile and moving it into a sustaining, productive, operational practice, and not stopping in 6 months because you don't see an ROI return. AI is a technology platform that learns over time with machine learning, and the more data and the additional data sets you add, increase your odds of success. You have to really have a view of the long term. This slide just identifies the different types of applications or use cases. The most significant one is obviously in the image classification or image recognition. So simple examples would be, our photographs, right? And classifying maybe any areas where Cathy's photo or image, has been on any particular system, if it's got permission. At the same time, if it's out in the World Wide Web, Cathy's already captured, you've got very sophisticated algorithms that are finding wherever Cathy is. A lot of vendors are now coming together and even sharing some of those databases as well, because the laws are not, once you've given permission in one and there's a partnership with another, things happen behind the scenes. So lots and lots of activity in terms of image recognition, but it's also the area that I know Cathy will talk about that probably has one of the highest risks of data bias, and also predicting outcomes that quite frankly, don't mirror maybe the world we really want to create as a society. And if you just looked at the very bottom example in human emotion analysis, right now with COVID, like if I'm on a phone call and I'm coughing, there's research underway that it can actually light up the entire telecom infrastructure to say how many people are coughing or have a cold in this particular region. And Germany is doing a lot of innovation on that side, linking voice to sound to correlate to lack of health. So, or in a call center and my voice is being captured and recorded, and across all of the calls that are made over the day, the week, the month, and how many people were sad, how many people, sounded disinterested, like that provides insight on the emotional or sentiment. So lots of different types of applications. I'm not going to drain this slide, but the top one's around image classification, lots of innovation on vision, and a tremendous amount around natural language processing, which is basically classifying words and then determining, interest patterns based on the clustering. Next slide. So big picture here, if you go into any of the larger organizations, there'll be some AI initiative underway at the enterprise level. The mid-market, some small businesses, less. The companies that are, I think, clearly more at risk for not innovating are going to be the small businesses and the mid-market. The larger entities have something going. It's just whether or not they're doing it right. I was in a discussion with a tier 1 bank, not too long ago. And all of their budget in AI, I think less than 10% had ever moved into a sustaining application. So being used for more research, discovery, answering hard questions, aggregating data, and that are too much data that they can't easily do a BI, a business intelligence extract. So, we really do need to sort of double down in building stronger operational understanding of how to use this technology effectively. The adoption rates, in terms of full scale, they're still very low, 17 to 30% adoption. Usually the major barrier here is access to, or lack of skills. I mean, these skills in AI and data science are not, inexpensive. You do have to shore up a lot of capital or make strategic decisions or upgrade your skills and talent to get there. And, so a lot of the work that's being done is very much on the technology side. I don't see enough focus on the ethical, responsible AI side and the risks. And I always ask people when I'm turning it over to Cathy to answer this question is, can you produce me a list now where all your AI algorithms are? I think as if you're a board director, just ask that question and you'll have everybody just scattering because they don't know. So Cathy, with great pleasure, I'm turning it over to you and we'll start moving into some of the frameworks and the risks as well. And I'll be back. Enjoy.
Thanks, Cindy. So Zach, if you want to, yes, thank you. And I think about, everything that Cindy had said and just how much AI has already infiltrated into many elements of our life. But if you think about it, there's still a very heavy exponential curve that needs to materialize for it to really be entrenched in the different use cases that it's capable of. And those capabilities are growing every day. One of the things that I'm seeing as I'm talking with our clients is even though they are utilizing AI and using it in a growing number of areas, they do tend to still be in the lower risk categories. And I think a lot of that is coming from this just general distrust around AI. Part of it is that it isn't, a technology that has been around for decades, but it's still very early in its infancy in regards to the broad corporate use that it's having and public use in public sector. And so I think it's that distrust, and not only, you know, with the end user, but also within the risk and compliance functions that I'm seeing within our clients, even with some of the project sponsors, which may be some of you on the call today. And so we do need to think about how we can challenge and move past that distrust, because I do think that that is holding back a lot of companies in being able to fully utilize the benefits of AI. You know, and that's being partly fueled by a lot of education is still being provided on AI through media, and they tend to sensationalize, you know, all the failures, and you know, and really bring a lot of concern around the lack of bias or the lack of explainability, or just like the just poor performance of, you know, some particular AI systems. And those certainly can happen. But I think that there are a lot of governance and risk mitigation controls that can be put in place that we'll hopefully talk through some more today. One of the things that I thought I'd mention, just still on this slide, Zach, thank you. The quote in the yellow, which is, you know, 85% of AI projects through 2020, Gartner had predicted would have erroneous outcomes. And I like to kind of focus on that because, first of all, that sounds really alarming. Like, who wants to start using a technology that's going to be expected to fail 85% of the time? Be honest, I really think that if you really knew how AI worked, you should really estimate that that would be 100%. At some point in time, every AI system is going to come to the bounds of its boundary conditions where it's going to make a mistake. It should be expected that it's going to make a mistake. And so I think a lot of times what happens is that a lot of organizations and executives go into using AI without the proper understanding of how this technology works. It's a system that's primarily based on making probabilities using incomplete or very disparate information. And just like any human, you know, providing some type of judgment in a more of a subjective area, you would expect it sometimes is going to not get it right. You need to go into AI projects with that understanding. And really the key goal should be making sure it works properly, but also having a really good understanding of when could it go wrong? When could it actually be pushed outside its original training? When could it be asked to use a data set that was not representative of what it saw in training? When could its, you know, accuracy and confidence rate be lower than my tolerance level? So all of those things, as we'll kind of get into, are things to be thinking about as you are planning to invest into AI. I think the top one is also important because, you know, ultimately with all these systems, you want them to be adopted. You want the ultimate consumers and users to trust in it. And I think it's just interesting that, and this is, you know, a little dated from a 2017 survey, but at that time, only 9% of consumers would allow AI to run their finances, and only 4% would trust it with HR related work. And yet, you know, as you'll see, you know, HR, financial services, the cars we drive, the planes we fly in, all have elements of AI already, and will continue to have more so. So I do think that there's a little bit of a disconnect also in regards to the end consumers even understanding of a lot of applications of AI that they're currently using and being impacted by and having no ill effect. That awareness is also important. So if you move to the next slide. So this is a interesting study that EY just published in July with Future Society. And they had basically surveyed both senior executives in companies as well as policymakers. And I thought what's really interesting is, as you can see through the two different bars, how they each responded quite differently on each of these subjects. So in the first one, the statement was, it is not possible to mandate AI explainability, since even developers don't always understand how it works. And you can see that the companies were very, high in agreeing with that statement, where policymakers were not. So that is a clear, issue where you've got that big of a gap between even what companies are indicating is feasible in regards to mandating the explainability of AI versus what policymakers either feel are in place or are required. Jumping down to the third one, it is not possible to regulate AI since algorithms are constantly evolving. Corporations, again, agreeing with that statement, very high rates of agreement, whereas policymakers not agreeing with it, feeling that, it should be possible to further regulate AI. And there currently is a bit of a dialogue because, policymakers certainly do not want to stifle innovation. They want investments into AI, but they also feel they have a stewardship to protecting end users and society. And so they are struggling with understanding not only how to balance those two competing priorities, but also recognize that it is a very evolving technology. But still, policymakers feel that they need to have a role in regulating AI, even as it is going through its states of evolution. And then last ones, asking, do regulators understand the complexities of AI technologies and business challenges? And again, corporations feeling that regulators don't understand the technology, while policymakers feeling they have a much better understanding, which may be kind of leading to some of the differences in the answers to the first three. So I just think it's a really interesting to see, just even in the current time frame, just where you've got that large of a gap. And there is a lot of rising concerns as to, with more regulations coming up in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, in Australia, Singapore, we're seeing lots of different governments following up previously published guidelines with some intentions to move into regulations. So a lot of those regulations are not yet in place. GDPR would probably be one of the few that is actually has some impact, but there are a lot that are currently being discussed and debated. So we can move to the next slide, please. So when we think about, why, managing the risks of AI is so important, is because there are many different risk categories that AI can impact. Now, not every AI system or application will impact all of these, but AI really needs to be understood that it's going to be a very impactful technology moving forward, and you're going to have a program and portfolio of AI systems and models. And so predominantly across that portfolio, each of these are going to be impacted. The first is market or competitive risk. One of the reasons why many corporate companies are moving forward with AI, despite some of its risks and its current level of immaturity, is because they recognize that there's a competitive risk if they don't. That if their competitors move forward with AI, the insights that it can provide, the implications in providing better services and more I don't know the word I'm trying to think of, but the more personable services that they can provide, is all going to help them to have that competitive advantage. I spoke earlier about some of the concerns about the AI failures being so highly prominent in the media, and that reputational risk is there. There's the compliant risk. There are a lot of current regulations over technology and interactions with consumers, corporate behavior that equally apply to artificial intelligence. For example, there's a lot of dialogue around bias, and everyone points to the existing non-discriminatory laws and regulations, which would govern any bias encompassed within an AI system or its outcomes. I think the final one, legal risk, is a really important one to start paying attention to, because there is a growing list of cases going to the courts in relation to AI. A lot of them tend to be right now focused on either privacy or bias, but yet we are starting to see fines and penalties and legal cases that have actually just shut down whole AI systems the day that the court case was announced or was awarded. And so there are growing legal risks as AI continues to proliferate, and as more of those AI systems are then compared back to existing laws and regulations. So if we move to the next page, please. So one of the things I think is really important in managing all of those four risk areas is understand the relationship between these two feedback loops. So if you think about wanting to create trust in AI or really any technology, that trust is going to grow as you exhibit trustworthy behaviors, and that's going to span the whole life cycle of AI, whether it's your stewardship around the data that you're given, the transparency that you have around the use of that data and the use of AI, the way that you react if something happens where you take you take accountability, you do the mitigation that's required, you can build trust through that as well. There is a way to build trust through your reaction to errors or failures. You know, that is all going to lead to a really strong reputation. That strong reputation is then going to lead to those more users, allowing you to kind of further demonstrate the trust that your broad user group has in you. The benefit of having more users, however, is also secondary in that, you know, the more users you have, the more data you're going to have available to you. That's going to allow you to build better AI, get those better insights, which will allow you to provide improved functionality, get ahead of your competitors. That's going to make you a desirable company to be, you know, consumers to be attracted to, which gives you those more users. And all those two feedback loops are going to continue to provide, you know, that stronger user base to yourself. But these two feedback loops can also work backwards. So if you are shown to be not exhibiting trustworthy behaviors, you're going to get a poor reputation, what's going to lead to lost users. If you have, you know, a loss in users, you're going to have less data than your competitors, which is going to impair your ability to have better insights and improve functionality. So that's going to then start to deteriorate your ability to provide services and strong products. So, you know, they're very intertwined. And, you know, a lot of the particularly digital services is really a fight these days for that strong user base. So we've moved to the next slide, please. So I've been talking a lot about building trust. So let's dig a little bit into, you know, what the conditions of trust is and what good looks like. So this is really 4 different conditions that when we built our Trusted AI framework back in 2018, we felt was really important in building that trust. The first is really having an ethical foundation to your technology build. And one of the reasons why ethics comes up a lot these days in regards, particularly with AI, is that if you think about some of the traditional legacy technologies that were more rules-based, you know, ethics came into that as well. It does even today. But, you know, some developer had to actually develop the rule base. And so the assumption is that through either their corporate code of conduct, their country values, their own personal values, religious values, all of those would come to bear for them to make good ethical choices. There's also, you know, professional standards they have to meet. The issue right now is that with AI, as we start to trust AI to make judgments that previously humans would be making, there has been this question as to, okay, whose ethics gets applied? How can we apply those ethics? Can we encode ethics? And, you know, there's been, you know, a lot of challenge, particularly by AI developers as to, are you holding AI up to a higher standard than you do humans? Because, you know, we have a lot of humans that make decisions that some of us would disagree in regards to their ethical basis. And yet, you know, we've felt, well, like AI could be an opportunity as we as a humanity to do better. But second of all, there is a concern that this is now being more globalized because AI can be more of a global type of application. And so wanting to make sure there is strong ethics embedded into that. But there is a lot of debate on what that means, how it looks like, and again, as I said, whose ethics do you include? Social responsibility is also a really big issue here, not only from, you know, a perspective of how we use AI and if it's biased, but also could AI lead to greater gaps in regards to the haves and have-nots? Is there equal access to the benefits of AI? Both as a consumer, but also as, you know, countries. And there's a lot of AI for good that can be done. A lot of the UN sustainable goals have a lot of AI projects that are aligned with them. And AI is one of those technologies that can also, if designed properly, can help to eradicate a lot of our societal problems and hopefully, you know, create some of those income disparities we currently have. Accountability is really important, particularly with AI, because AI doesn't tend to be one big system that's controlled by one corporate entity, but can be a multitude of components, whether it's multiple algorithms working together, Internet of Things sensors that are providing data, video feeds, you know, hardware like an autonomous vehicle that has to operate. All of those have to be able to interact and communicate on a very fast network. There's so many different components to a system that is using AI. And so it can kind of blur the accountability when something goes wrong because there's so many components. There can be a difference as to, even in a particular algorithm, that it could have had 5 different sources. Some that were written internally, open source code that was pulled down, a couple of, maybe it was built on the backbone of a third-party system that was licensed. And so there can be a blur in regards to ultimately who owned the code. And so it's really important to understand your particular accountability, whether you're the designer or the operator or user of AI, and making sure that you understand the risks and ensure you've got good governance. The last is reliability, which is just ensuring that it performs as intended, that you really are ensuring it's robust, it can be relied upon under all the different conditions that it's being asked to operate. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So basically, when you think about AI, this slide, although you can't see the circle very well, really 2 things I'll point out. The first is the colorful circle, which really dictates 8 different steps that are really involved in whether you are developing an AI system or you are purchasing it. You first of all, in the green, have to start with problem identification. Then you move into data acquisition and processing. Then you move into the core of its modeling and training and validation, and then deployment and monitoring. Along each of those 8 steps are a multitude of risks that could manifest themselves that have to have the appropriate governance and controls. But probably the one that I feel is the primest importance is the problem identification stage, because it's going to drive everything after that in regards to the data that you'll be sourcing, the objective function that you set for the algorithm, the performance monitoring that you feel is important in place. And so it's really important in that problem identification stage that you have spent a lot of time there, having a lot of different people with different perspectives challenging on what could go wrong, because it's really, that's at the design stage where you can really test from a prototype perspective what this algorithm could do and where some of its failure points could be. And that's where, to my earlier comment, you can really start to anticipate where it might go wrong and put up those exception routines and governance processes to address it. So looking quickly around the assertions on the outside, starting in number 1, performance. So I mentioned before about reliability, and this is really tied to performance, ensuring that the system is accurate, it performs well, and that it will give you the desired level of precision and consistency throughout the different environments or conditions of which it operates. Bias is really important in ensuring that it's unbiased, I should say. And there's a lot of ways in which to actually utilize the design of AI to reduce historical biases that we have existing in our current data sets and through previous decisions, but it has to be designed in order to achieve that outcome. Resiliency, which is ensuring that not only thinking about it from a robustness perspective and availability, but also is it secure from adversarial attacks, which are a little different because adversarial attacks can actually be manifested through the way that information is ingested into the AI. Could someone manipulate the AI decision framework by changing some of the data that it's fed? So that's another area to be thinking about. Explainability is really important to ensure that the level of explainability that you need. So if you're in a very heavily regulated industry where you are going to need to be able to explain certain outcomes, recommendations, or decisions that were driven out of an AI system, ensuring then that you pick the right AI algorithm model, training methods, output, so that you can actually meet that expectation. That has to become one of the requirements you list out in the problem identification stage. And then the last is transparency, which is really one of the current criticisms, is that a lot of AI use is not transparent. So it's happening in the back without users recognizing that it's happening. And it's, I think some of the legal cases recently have really criticized the lack of transparency, where stakeholders that are impacted from the recommendations or decisions out of the AI systems do not have the knowledge that that AI system is using and having that potential impact. So if we move to the next slide, please. So I thought I'd just kind of dig into some of the bias examples. So what I think is interesting with the first one is that, this was a fairly simple system, a visual recognition system that was taking images, and it was trying to associate, different activities with genders. And so part of the data set, they recognized that in that data set, 33% more of the images of cooking were actually had women associated with that activity. But when the algorithm actually developed its decision framework, it actually amplified the disparity and actually to 68%, doubling it. And that's partly because, again, going back to the problem identification stage, is making sure that you actually are designing the algorithm with an objective function that will actually guard against, some of this amplification that it could happen because of the way that its objectives have been set. The second one is really interesting. This is in the Netherlands, where just back in the early February 2020, that the government was actually taking all of these different data sources that they'd previously had in siloed databases, and they were bringing them together to try to detect which constituents could potentially have a higher instances of tax or benefit fraud. But they were actually disbanded from actually continuing to use the system because it went to court and it was found to be quite biased in that it was really targeting a lot of its surveillance to areas in neighborhoods that had lower income and higher immigrant status. And it also felt that there was a lack of transparency about how this was being used and that they were using information they'd collected under other purposes and using it for this purpose without appropriate consent and notification to the users. There's a couple of other examples here just where, the Apple Card, which has been shown to be discriminatory, where a couple who had very similar characteristics, like the information they fed to get their credit card were very similar, and yet the husband got 10 times the credit limit as the wife. And so there's, so many examples of that is happening. And so I think what's really important for you in your context is really to understand each of these cases in regards to the different risks that manifest and thinking about in your own situation how you can try to guard against those. So if we move to the next slide. So here's an area where, we've started to, when we work with our clients to try and achieve that objective, is really breaking down that 8-step development process that I mentioned into these 5 mega processes, with each of them having, sub-processes that are involved, and really mapping through each of those sub-processes as to what are all the different risks that could occur and what kind of governance and control mechanisms do you have in place, and how mature are they to deal with both the generic risks of just your AI portfolio in general, but also the unique use cases that you are intending to apply AI. And so, there's certainly these frameworks that are available and this kind of structure in order to do that kind of assessment and maturity evaluation. So if we just move to the next slide. And so what's really important here is to recognize that you need to look at these controls and governance, not just in connotation of the specific AI project, which is really what the circle represents, which could be kind of replicated over and over again as you have each of your AI projects, but really thinking about it in the context of your broader enterprise. So, what is your AI strategy? Cindy opened her section in talking about, the importance of developing your AI strategy and thinking about what it is that you want to achieve. And, those critical questions at the bottom, important one is, why are we investing in AI? What are we hoping to achieve? What are those objectives and value we hope to, if it's just to show that you're investing in AI, you're most likely not to get the ROI that you're planning to achieve. From a governance perspective, I think some important questions are, should we be using AI in this particular context? Is it the right technology? Is a probability-based system, what we should be using, or something more rules-based? Is the technical capabilities currently of AI commensurate with the requirements I have for this particular use case? And would it be lawful and ethical, considering, current regulations and expectations? I think assessing your current AI capability is also important, because probably one of the areas we find most difficult with governance is that on paper, there is a very strong governance structure described and documented, but it falls short in implementation, primarily because of lack of capabilities. And that could be capabilities in understanding controls and governance required in your innovation teams, but also just as important, the lack of AI understanding in your risk and compliance functions in the business domain areas that are going to be the prime users and operators of AI. And so it's really doing that full capability assessment across your enterprise. And then really understanding what you will do and how you'll do it. And then on the back end, I think it's really ensuring that you've got good monitoring and functions. And so where you can ask those questions, are you comfortable that it's working in all conditions? Is it doing any harm of which you're not detecting? Is it robust and safe? Do stakeholders embrace it? Are you getting that adoption? And ultimately, are you getting the ROI that you want to achieve? And then on the bottom is just a recognition that you actually have a lot of existing governance that you can draw upon, but most likely some of it will need to be modified, and you may have gaps that you need to fill to be fully supportive of AI. So maybe the next slide, please. So Cindy, I guess this is back to you.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Cathy, for laying the groundwork and the framework. What I'm going to do now for about the next 15 minutes is I'm going to work through a case study in terms of a whole life cycle of a large client of ours. And just to give you context, it's a company that has over 12,000 employees across North America. They provide both B2B and B2C services enablement. It's a large logistics provider. You know, if you've been following the market closely, you'd know that B2C business models are exploding in growth. So obviously there's lots of disruption going on. A very large cloud migration is going on. So the recognition, one of the key things is access to data. A lot of people don't understand that 80% of an AI project is based on access to data and getting the data and the methods all organized to actually enable solving the problem. So out of your whole life cycle, you know, getting AI right is highly dependent on the data. To Cathy's earlier point, do you have a representative data set? Do you have the conditions and the guardrails around it? How are you accessing it? How are you enabling people to build their models, right? What tools are they using? So that whole data access and data methods is a large part of the journey in building AI outcomes. So an organization that has infrastructure like SAP that's handling the ERP infrastructure, Salesforce handling the Sales Cloud infrastructure, and also Service Cloud, which is a Salesforce offering. So quite a complex technology environment. They do have a BI function that does advanced analytics, and also have been investing with AI talent, and it's an account we've been working with for about now 3 years. Next slide. Now, in terms of the big problem, it's so important when we've gone into accounts where the executive leadership team has not been clear on the problem, and they've left it to, you know, we all have grown up with skunk works, and we all find ways of getting things done. And there's nothing better than a group of engineers that have got access to data. You know, we're all very creative people in that regard. But to sustain a journey, if you don't have the executive sponsorship, you're not going to be able to go the long haul. And so I always say to people, get lined up at the top, get the education going. If you took a group of board directors and CEOs and you asked them to define AI and gave them a sticky, you would like to get different answers. If you ask them to explain the methods to solve different use cases, they might not be able to answer. The CIO, more often than not, has not been trained in AI. And, you know, but the business people aren't tech savvy. So often, you know, the answers that are there, they don't have an expert in the room. And as a result, you can have a lot of erroneous conversations. So there's nothing more important than the question. So in this case, it was, how can we grow more rapidly using AI? So there was an anchor. It was around growth and enablement as an outcome to basically secure a competitive advantage. There's lots of grayness in this area, but that anchor at the executive leadership team has allowed them to create some very thoughtful use cases. So let's go to the next slide. So the use cases that are underway, and some having tremendous outcomes. One is our technology predicts futures on revenues. and forecasts and prioritizes all the opportunities. So if you have a sales organization with 300 to 500, you basically wake up in the morning and you are advised by the AI agent as to what are the best opportunities to get you to your plan. I'm a former Xerox sales executive, and I've always been concerned that usually the top 20% of my sales teams in the past made up for the balance of the others. And then we'd always lob off the bottom 15%. But that middle tier, we always hire, all your organizations hire bright people. So this science, there's no question, I've been pioneering in this field now for about 7 years. It is extremely good at mid to large companies and prioritizing what you should be doing versus others. And also the AI can give you the parameters as to why you're going to lose. Right at the top of the funnel, this lead channel is a poor channel. This particular dollar value that you've put in, there's never been one deal in the history of the thousands of deals that's been out there. So it shows you, your odds of success. So you can, play as to, it's just like a series of chessboard games, and AI can plot all the moves across all the historical wins and losses and guide you. So I get pretty excited about this, as you probably can see. The other use case that is in play is customer churn rates, and in terms of call centers, how can you get earlier signals that you might have churn rates? Obviously that data can come through some very creative areas. It can be the responsiveness of the emails. Cathy and I chat all the time. All of a sudden, totally different tone, sentiment mining. Cathy's language changes. She used to always joke. She no longer jokes. Why is that? So these sciences can classify intentionality and propensity to purchase and give you good signals. And so the whole aspect of aggregating large data sets to predict customer churn is a really robust area in the market right now. The third area is more around optimal yield. And what I mean by that is, what's the best margin that you could attribute to a deal or a transaction, and what could be the most optimal route to yield the harvest, the most maximum margin. And when you've got thousands of permutations or even millions, these sciences can be very, very good in optimizing outcomes. So 3 use cases underway. Next slide. I've already described the tech stack. I'll only mention Marketo's in there as well. And obviously we're in there as the AI platform, and then Amazon is obviously where the cloud, all the data is currently in heavy migration. Next slide. So in terms of the approach, and we've been in, I'm kind of laughing here, but we've kind of learned the hard way too, right? Where, you sign a big contract, you're ready to get going, you can hardly wait. The engineers are all psyched up to solve the use case. And then when you get into the data side, you find out there's no documentation or very little, and you find that the data is distributed across 5 or 6 or 7 or maybe 8 functions. And you really have to bring the organization together to get some good data lineage and documentation. And unless you have that, you really may not understand some of the logic that's in the data set. And so that data lineage function, and I can't stress enough the importance of having good data that's documented, that's in a central repository, that has a data dictionary, that there's clear owners, there's clear connections to process. Otherwise, the AI dudes, myself, others, we can take a data set and we can create something pretty, easy and apply some different algorithms, but that's not doing your organization justice, because at the end of the day, it's all about sustainability and transparency. And if you understand the data and the attributions, when the outputs come, you can, the organization can continue to appreciate the context. But that's an area that's very, very broken. We say data is a strategic asset, and yet when you peel the onion back, I'm sure, Cathy, with your audits, you find, just the sheer volume of data, poor practices and poor processes at times. So that, I think, is a big issue. And as I said before, 80% of AI does need robust, valid, thoughtful data. And that front end, if you rush into just doing your modeling, which many companies are doing, you're missing probably, a successful outcome and probably putting your organization at a legal and regulatory risk because you just, aren't putting enough time and the effort. Now, within the,
Cindy,
yeah,
there was a question I thought might be best answered just from
sure,
what you just said. It
sure.
was asked, how big are the investments in data collection, and when will be the return on investment? Is it months? It is years? And how can they reduce the investment time?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm a pretty practical gal. So, what I mean by that is in this case, there was a return on the investment in less than 6 months that drove the incremental revenue to enable a full year, 2-year program. So, you have to have the business team logic into the actual routes. If you only have data people that are data management, data lineage, data documentation people, they'll spend years trying to perfect things. So the point, I think, is obviously at what point do you have enough validity? So take a challenge that you can, that you can get your arms around, I think is really what I'm trying to say. So you can build momentum. Momentum builds success and confidence. But if an organization has been at this, which it seems like forever, something's wrong, I would say. We're big believers in agile, but you can get a return on an AI project in three months or 6 months. Doesn't have to be years. Remember, you can't look at solving the whole elephant and eating it all at once. You're going to a particular domain. Might take you, if it's not good data, might take you say 3 months to clean things up, and then you can do one initial sample and validate. And that can actually shore up confidence to maybe clean up the rest of that data because you can perform experiments, right? And, we're seeing in some of the deployments getting up to levels of 95% prediction accuracy. We actually have one account that's at 99%. Scary. We're almost embarrassed to say it. 99% accuracy on predicting every single opportunity, whether they'll win or lose. Now, what a nice, comfortable experience that is during COVID, right? So good question. I'll just continue on. There's just a lot in here. So the most important point, I think, is at the end, before we go to the next slide, Zach, is once you've got the data and the access and the enablement, there are so many different techniques in AI. It's so important that everybody understand there are thousands and thousands of approaches. This is not a one-trick pony. AI is like a big umbrella. Machine learning. Then there's all different kinds of algorithms and approaches, methods and techniques to solve different use cases. So if I'm doing an image relator, I'm going to be taking image classification techniques. If I'm using natural language parsing, I'm going to be using a different set of techniques. And that means the engineers that I recruit are going to be different to solve the different use cases. So as you set up your functions, you really need to understand the technical problem or a business use case, and then associate the right team. And that's where I think organizations struggle. That they believe they may have one Python dude or dudess, and they think they're set. Well, no, not quite. There's a lot of complexity in this field. So again, the defining the question, the data, and then diving deep into what methods, approaches, techniques to solve that use case is also partially part of the journey. And this is an area where often people get disappointed, with what's being produced, because they may spend 2 years. I mean, we've got one account now that spent 3 years building a model. And now we're looking at the model. The model was written in not Python, but in R. But it was so simple against the use case. So no wonder they're not harvesting the outcome. So, the devil's in the details here. Talent is critical in this field. Next slide. I got to speed this up. Okay, next slide. I think I've already kind of said this, but it's a reinforcement that the outcomes are only going to be as good as the effort in those first few phases. So if you've got a project and you've spent, you started off in first month starting to actually train train and build, and the engineers are building, buyer beware. You've probably skipped a whole series of steps, and your risks are actually, they may not be high, but you could be in a very vulnerable situation. So, this slide again, this material is going to come back. I look at AI just simply, it's like a toddler. You get something up, and then you have to recognize that if you really care about this field, you are going to continue to feed and nurture and enable forever. When you stop, they atrophy. And they'll continue to predict. You may, because if you leave them, business changes, data changes, they need monitoring, and they may need a retraining every 6 months, maybe shorter, depending on your environment, depending on the speed of what's happening in the market. Next slide. Yeah, this one here is just really about, what we've experienced is we're getting to some points where we've got 1000x improvements in some of the initiatives. We put 10x here only because it seems more believable, but literally we have 1000x improvements in terms of some of our cases now. And they've always been around growth. That's what my expertise is growth acceleration. That's why I did my doctoral studies, and there's no question that these sciences are powerful. You just have to anchor all the right practices and processes and infrastructure. And not for a nanosecond, your CIO may have some of the skills, they may not. The wise CIOs are recognizing they need to augment, and they're not afraid of bringing in other talent that maybe the language is different than theirs. They know that they need to have specialists. Next slide. So with the few minutes I have left, I just want to close that, we talked about the governance imperative, and you can get underway without a complete governance operating model early. Sometimes you start off in a functional AI enablement, but the key thing is the executive sponsorship. So in our case, we've had the CFO involved from the get-go, CIO, as well as the senior VP that owns the customer experience management value chain. And that's great because you got a really strong business expert process-wise. You've got IT because, they got to keep the guardrails on and the cloud enablement. And also they want to make sure that their engineers are learning. And the CFO is awesome because they always care about a return, and as fast and earlier the better. So those were these are the executives that are surrounding all of these investment initiatives. And obviously through that, the client's been building up new talent, into their team and expanding their AI data science capabilities. And obviously we're in there as a trusted, team, kind of, smacked together as we go through the enablements. And on the communication side, my caution would be communicate at the right time. Sometimes you can get, everybody gets really excited, and maybe too many people want to get involved. You really do need to manage tightly. So, communicate when you actually have a result that's worthy of talking about. I see sometimes people showing up to communication too early, and that's not always good. So caution on when you communicate and make sure there's some value. Next slide. In closing, and then I'm turning this back to Cathy, I think don't lose sight that it's a long journey. If you make a decision to approach a program and you let go in 9 months or 6 months, because you're not seeing enough return, then there's something wrong with the problem, the data, the approach, the team. Don't think it's AI that's the problem, would be my coaching. You have to really take it serious about getting it right from the get-go. And sometimes you need external people with expertise that have been successful building sustainable practices. Next slide. So Cathy, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about scaling up and some of our closing comments, and then over to Howard. And hopefully we've bridged some of the strategic with some execution experiences.
Cindy, maybe before I talk to this slide, there's one question that came through. Predictive model. A model is a simplification of the reality. How do you keep the model most simple, but also very accurate and useful?
Well, that question you can answer in a few dimensions. So first of all, you have to let AI surface what it believes are the most significant attributions, right? When you're doing a modeling exercise. So when the predictive model comes up, depending on the scope of the data set, the model sizes, as this individual would know, can vary. If you have a model that has very few attributes, I would say less than 10, I would not consider it very smart. That would be from our experience. I think we typically build models and have models that are locked in that are between 50 and 100 attributes. That's kind of been our experience. And in terms of keeping it fresh, the monitoring systems are going on every single second because we have audit trails. So every time there's new data that comes in, there's a log and there is a visualization of what percentage was accurate and the confidence of predictive accuracy. And then we monitor in a deeper dive with the data scientists every 3 months. And you have to keep the life cycle going because you want to make sure it's stable. And sometimes, obviously with COVID, I think the risk factor here is that the business environment has changed. So certain industries that may have been successful last year, like the retail restaurant industry is a good example. You may have had lots of success selling to that particular environment, but that's not the case now. So all the historical data that you've trained the model on no longer is relevant for that industry, and then you have to discount that industry. And so there may be some, I call it strategic intervention in the algorithm to discount, and you may have to add another mathematical framework because the data that you have simply isn't representative of some of the environment. So you will find those adjustments that are needed sometimes. So you have to be astute as well. These things are only as good as what you feed it, right?
Right. No, exactly. There was also a question about whether we would be sharing out the slides. So we will be sharing out the slides, and you will be getting a recording of this whole event that you can go back and look at the slides and also hear our discussions. Just to wrap it up, I was just going to talk through some of these lessons learned that Cindy and I have both found to be really good practices to set up that strong governance structure. This certainly isn't all of them, but it's some of the key ones to be thinking about. Certainly we've heard some of the technology companies in particular and some of the startups have created AI ethics boards. Some of them are just internal to the organization. Some of them involve external representation. You don't necessarily have to formalize it into a board, but I think what is just most important from this is to bring that diversity of thought to the design table, to bring people to the table that you feel can be contrarian, that is going to have a different perspective, maybe a different stakeholder view, a different life experience, different capabilities and competencies from the core innovation team that can really ask those really targeted questions, again, going back to those what can go wrongs, so that, in doing the design and governance build out for these systems, that you can try and think as much ahead where some of those error and failures may occur. I think what's really important is to really stand back and think about, as an organization, what is going to be those ethical design standards that you're going to follow. There's actually quite a few out there now available. Over the last couple of years, we've seen quite a lot of different guiding principles that have been published by technology companies, by standard setters, by governments, by industry associations. So there really is a plethora of guidance available. It's really starting to think about, in your particular context, the geography that you operate with, the corporation and industry, what might be the best ethical standards for you to follow, and then finding a way to incorporate those into guiding standards and procedures for your innovation teams. I think it's really important, the third one, because how can you govern something you don't know is there? Both Cindy and I have had a lot of conversations with senior executives where they bring up the fact that they are concerned that AI algorithms and models exist within their organization and they don't know that they are there. They don't know what they're being used for. They don't know the kind of governance or controls or testing that those algorithms were subject to. And so it's really important to think about how you can develop this inventory. And a lot of the early inventories have been manual, email-based surveys, inventory listings, and those really aren't going to get the job done, particularly as the use of algorithms really starts to exponentially increase. So you do need to be thinking about how you can create those automated inventories. And one of the areas that we've been piloting with clients is using your asset management software, so that you can use that to kind of interrogate through the different laptops, the servers, to find footprints of these AI algorithms. We've also extended it to do advanced analytics and robotics process automation. So it can become a really valuable tool to identify where your AI inventory is, who's using it. You can also compare some of the tools they're finding against your InfoSec and procurement policies to find gaps there. But ultimately what's important is that you now know where it is, who's doing it, and you can now determine that they're not under the right governance framework. And, and then start to think about the risk assessment you want to do for those systems. So impact assessments to stakeholders is an important activity to be thinking about early on, to better understand where risk could manifest. Validation tools are really important. If you are an organization that has had a lot of use of advanced analytics, most likely you've already had some type of model validation practices and competencies in place. But for many sectors, that hasn't necessarily been the case. And so this is going to be a really important testing mechanism, because AI is not tested like previous technologies through the traditional system integration and user acceptance testing processes. It really does require a lot of in-depth model validation by capabilities that are very strong in data and the data science behind algorithms. And so that's really important. Awareness training, and I would, kind of similarly to some of the talent conversations we've had, you need to think about awareness training, recognizing you've got two very different populations. You've got data scientists, many of which came from academia, that don't necessarily understand the full corporate context of which they're now operating and that their systems need to operate within. So they need to better understand that governance and corporate control framework that systems need to operate within. But then you're going to have your domain specialists that really understand their domain. They understand that corporate governance requirements, but they don't necessarily understand the AI technology. So you need to basically teach both areas, the different missing domains, so that they can really work as an integrated team. And then the last is thinking about the role of independent audits. There certainly has been a lot more conversations about certification programs. Those are still probably at least a year away because the standards are still being developed. But you do need to kind of start thinking about, beyond just your internal validation tools, if you need to build trust, thinking about maybe where independent audits could also help in that framework. So I believe that, Cindy, that was going to be our kind of last conversation around kind of governance and controls. And so certainly open to other questions that you may have, which you can add in the question and answer. But Howard, I'm not sure if you've got some questions as well.
Absolutely. Excellent discussion today. Thank you. So Cathy, what are the AI guidelines we should follow from an audit point of view?
So, certainly within internal audit groups, the Internal Audit Association in particular has provided some guidance in regards to helping internal audit groups think about AI, but I still think a lot of it is still being developed. So in support of whether it's an audit or a certification of systems, there are a number of guiding principles and some draft standards that have been released, but they don't really go to the depth of really articulating what success criteria look like. So I've been working with the IEEE, the Institute of Engineers and Electrical Engineers, on developing a standard. They're currently focusing in 3 areas: accountability, transparency, and bias. And they will be actually developing success criteria. So it'll be not only what is the risk and what is the expected control activity, but giving some more granularity as to what it should actually look like. I expect that should be available in some early 2021. And then we can maybe start thinking about using that as a criteria for audits. So, there's certainly a lot of great minds and organizations collaborating together to develop that kind of audit standards and the ultimate attestation and certification framework. But I still think it's in, evolution probably over the next year.
Thank you. This is a question from Christian Duarte. Any relevant examples of important mistakes in the adoption of AI?
Yes, that's a very good question. What I've learned is as I mentioned before, if you communicate too early and you don't have enough substance, you have to recognize any change management practice, right? You'll always have your early adopters, and then you'll have your laggards. It's very important to build the right communication to the different stakeholders and be very, very fact-based. So, you definitely need to be attentive to change management and efficient communication. Having the executive leadership team go through an educational program is really key. I mean, Howard, we know that from the diverse sessions we've been doing with CEOs across Canada. Cathy and I, we know from our early work and all the work that Cathy's doing, which is amazing worldwide, that if the educational foundations are not there, it's very hard to have the language conversation. Also, skills assessment of the existing talent and what skills they really have. You may have some amazing, like one of our clients, we found a master's in spatial analytics, patterning recognition, deep statistics, deep business knowledge, no AI knowledge. Well, then let's get that person trained up. That person has the good profile to be a data scientist. So, take inventory of your skills and talent. That confidence helps shore up the change management side, Howard, because people, they really embrace talents that they respect, especially when a person's been in the company for quite a period. So you have to take, the typical change management constructs you do in any type of, innovation and, double down there. It's not just a technology agenda. I mean, it's one field where you have to bring your legal team to learn, your HR team to learn, your IT, the CEOs, the board directors. I mean, if you're really serious about it, if you don't lay that educational foundation, you have people talking across each other. And so, yeah, I could tell lots of stories about things that have gone wrong, but I like to talk about things that are important to go right. I would build on to Cathy's points, just a little point. There is a whole new infrastructure called machine learning operations that has new software that you can keep track of all your bottles. It gives you all the tools. The Azure platform, on the Microsoft stack has a set of tools. Amazon, the H2O.ai framework is excellent. So, you do need different asset infrastructure that allows you to have all your models inventoried. And then in those frameworks, there is the ability to apply the different algorithms and also record all the history. And so that ease of access. So you definitely have to invest in new toolkits to allow centralized access. Otherwise, the scientists are, got modeling on their desktops and maybe no check-in, check-outs. And, so I know about that racket too. Yeah.
Maybe just to quickly add a couple other examples as well, Cindy. So I've seen quite a few times where the AI development team kind of operates in a bit of a vacuum. They think they're doing all the right things, and then they go to actually move it into production, and they hit this huge wall where all their risk and compliance requirements start hitting them, and they realize they had so many things they didn't appreciate they had to meet, and it all of a sudden pushes them back into the lab. It elongates their development process and really impacts the ultimate trust and adoption of the AI system. So that's something to definitely bring those different groups to the design table very early. Another example I had was really under appreciating the downstream impacts of the AI system. So I had early on, when I was working in this, had identified a use case that EY was helping a client with, and they were talking it through with me. And because I'm at a CPA, I could quickly see how what they were working on was going to impact data that could have a material impact to a financial statement of account. But they didn't realize that. So when I started asking them how they're designing the AI algorithm, they mentioned they were developing it to an 80% confidence interval, which, in academia is a fairly standard, I understand. I don't develop a lot of them myself, but it's an acceptable level of confidence. And yet for financial reporting, that is solely under what is required. And so, when I pointed out to them the downstream impact, they were able to go back to their business sponsors, and everyone agreed that, yeah, we need this at a much higher level of confidence. But again, that was going to impact the later adoption if this kind of downstream impact hadn't been mitigated and managed before it went into production.
Very good. So Cindy, over to you. What are the top 3 questions you believe a board director should ask of a CEO?
Oh, I would start with number 1. And I would ask an open-ended question and ask them, how are you looking at AI to, either augment the business model or improve? Just listen. I mean, a board director's role is duty of care, right? But first, I think step is listen and ask an open-ended question. They'll say something. Then maybe the second question you can ask is, do we have a documented strategy? Think holistically, right? Versus, are there specific projects underway? That might be the third one. You will always find that most of the organizations have not invested in formal executive leadership education at the board director level, the C-suite, and then if you go down a level, it's been in drips. I was just on a board call this morning, actually, on this topic on a board that I'm on. So the imperative to level set knowledge is key. But those would be 3 top ones. And Cathy and I stressed at the beginning, where are your algos? That really spurs them into thinking, where are my little rugrats running around? And they're there. But do you know, and also, when you do know them, who's last reviewed them? Are they still valid? Like, there's a lot of algorithms doing predictions that haven't been monitored, and they're just running and running and running. They're in this loop.
Got it. Question from a gentleman named Edgar Kirschman. In your experience, what percentage of the data is in the company that is currently available already, if you will, and the percentage of data which has to be generated newly? Just an overall estimation.
Yeah, I think that's a hard question to ask, because I don't think it's the right question. The question is, what problem are you trying to solve, right? And then you'll know. But I start there. So our experience is, if I'm solving a problem in terms of, call center voice analytics, they've got voice recordings, that could be 100% because I've got the data set. So I think it's dangerous to split things out, in or out. It always goes back to the problem. If I'm a small business, for example, it might be that if I want to grow my business, then maybe I should, work with a company like LeadSift, where they will, with AI, bring me the leads for propensity to purchase, because I don't have the data internally. It could be 100%. In that case, it would be 100%. So it will vary from use case to use case. Yeah, that's been our experience, is start with the problem, the use case, figure out what you have, what you don't have. Mature organizations or large enterprises will always have enough in-house. And then it's more about augmenting, and it varies in the size of the company and the use case.
Very good.
What I was also going to quickly add is that I do think that AI as a technology can best be utilized if you put together a inventory of use cases, of business problems you're trying to solve, because each of them are going to be different in how you rate the availability of data, the quality of that data, the capabilities that you have, the importance and impact of the ultimate outcomes. And what that can do is it can at least allow you to do some prioritization. So, if you've got some really impactful use cases, business objectives where you don't have the data, you can be just starting a project to get access to the data you need, while at the same time getting some like low-hanging fruit for some AI applications that maybe be a little lower impact, but you've got the data readily available. So, you know, you're still moving towards getting that ultimate, more impactful business objective, but you know, you're more strategically trying to utilize your capabilities, and realistically recognizing some of the, if you don't have the data readily available, then you need to get it, but that may take time and effort. So what can you be doing in the meantime?
Just a couple of other questions. Just want to be mindful of our time. But Cathy, where can we recruit the right talent to build an AI data sciences function?
Well, certainly I think a lot of data scientists today are coming from academia, and there are a lot of schools now that are developing these type of programs. And so that is always going to be a great source. There are a lot of data scientists that have, really developed a lot of expertise in the different technology companies. But I think what's also important is to not forget the existing employee base that you have. The demand for data scientist skills far exceeds the supply. And so you do need to be thinking about your existing workforce and how can you train them and enable them to be able to help you in your innovation and digitization efforts. And you might have some of them that are actually really interested and keen in learning this kind of technology, and so being able to identify that and nurture it, I think, will also be really important.
Okay, very good. Another question for you, Cathy. What are the types of benefits one often sees from AI modeling projects?
The benefits can be really quite varied depending on the different use case. I think ultimately we try to tell our clients that even though AI can help you in your bottom line, it can help you to be more efficient, more effective. Ultimately, it will most likely come on efforts to the top line. Thinking about how to use AI, as Cindy originally spoke about, on how to be more effective in your sales and marketing activities. How can you create more personable experiences by better understanding your clients and their needs? How can you develop products that are more addressing the functionality and needs of your clients? So, getting those kind of insights to really create that competitive advantage and really grow the top line revenue is going to be a really interesting benefits.
Very good. Another question, where can we source the right skills to advance our AI governance strategy?
Well, Cathy and I would love a conversation, whether together or separately. We've been dedicating our lives to advancing this conversation. I think, we've all learned a great deal in this area. So yeah, just my favorite line is bring it on.
Okay. I guess the last question would be, what do you mean, Cindy, when you use the term data lineage, and what does machine learning operations mean?
Sure. Data lineage is essentially just a life cycle term. So when you're solving a use case, I'll just give you a concrete example. Let's say my problem is I want to predict whether I'll win or lose. So, in this case, we're looking at Salesforce data and we're picking up all the historical wins and losses from the pipeline. And then in terms of the machine learning side, right, the data is learning over time. So the data lineage really relates to the source of the data and where it's moving in relationship to the workflow. And then, if it's coming in from maybe one feed's coming in from the SAP database, another feed could be coming in a Salesforce database, another feed could be coming in from Financial Force. And together, those different data constructs are enabling you to build a model and to train a data set against those different sources. So data lineage is really, just where is the data, which repository, how is it structured? Is there a particular logic embedded already in that field attribution? And it's just documenting things. Obviously, you can produce data schemas pretty easily, technically, but it may not have the context and the information that a business user could understand because it's too techy. When it gets to the machine learning ops, that's a whole new industry growing incredibly rapidly. Just like we built out ERP, we're now building out a new category called machine learning operations. And that's basically the inventory management life cycle of the whole modeling. So capturing the data, moving it into a particular work area so that the modeling team can work. But as the models are created, because it's never usually one model, you might basically have an algorithm applied against 1,000 models in a machine learning operational model. And then you're looking at the one that has the highest scores, or higher, less false positives, things like that. So it's an interesting industry right now, where a lot of the investments that companies have made in IT asset management don't have all the capabilities that a machine learning operations platform has. So there are new software vendors out in this category. Obviously, SaaS is renaming their infrastructure to machine learning ops, but there's new players like Data Robot. I think Ernst & Young uses that platform. We use H2O.ai. It's one of the leading platforms in the market, mainly because of open source and access. But yeah, there's lots on the web. Just type in ML ops, but it's a new category classification of software.
Thank you so much, Cindy. We're just about at our time. I want to thank my colleagues for a very, very interesting discussion today. I think we covered a lot of ground. We will be sending you the slide deck to the attendees. And we want to thank you all for your participation today, and have a great day, and everybody be safe.
Thanks, Howard.
Bye-bye.